Hello?
Jake?
Yes?
Hi, it's Julie Griffey. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. I'm glad you can hear me okay. We have a crazy audio system rigged up here to facilitate this process.
Well, how do you want to proceed?
Well, I just first wanted to ask you about how you first ended up at SRI.
Oh,
What
well,
brought you there in the first place?
that's a sort of a circuitous process. Uh, let's see. I went to West Liberty State College, which is in West Virginia, and I was actually interested in art, but the art department was very weak in those days. So the chemistry department was much better, so I decided to major in chemistry. And then I went on to graduate school at Purdue in biochemistry, and I finished my coursework for a PhD, but we were living on minimal amounts of money at the time, and I got tired of that, so I thought I would leave and earn some money and come back. But what happened was I got a job at Chemical Abstracts in Ohio, and I was fascinated by the size of the amount of information they had to deal with, and the fact that they were just barely getting computerized, and that the whole idea of handling information just intrigued me, and so I never went back to chemistry. But then I saw there was a job at SRI where they were going to have information specialists associated with the research groups, because projects would come in and the scientists would need a lot of information in a hurry, and they wanted it tailored to their needs. In other words, standard library procedures were very slow and they didn't work for projects like that. So I headed up a group that we were kind of farmed out to various groups at SRI to get the information they needed. In those days, there were no, you didn't do it by computer. You did it by brute force. They had these huge compendiums of information. Of course, my specialty was the chemical abstracts indexes and all that, because I edited them when I was at Chem Abstracts. And then we had a specialist in economics, and we had a specialist in engineering, that kind of thing. So in doing that, I met a lot of people at the Institute, and one of which was Douglas Englebart. And he, I don't know if you know who he is, but he was the inventor of the mouse, and almost everything that we do today, he did way back in the 60s.
Are you referring to Doug Englebart?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Anyway, Doug did this thing called the Big Demo, which just blew everybody away, because it had people interacting with computers at things that they'd never done before. When you went to put something on a computer in those days, first of all, you had to know either Fortran or COBOL or assembly language to get it on the computer in the first place, and second of all, nobody touched computers. You handed it to somebody who knew what computers were supposed to do, and came back later and hopefully got some results. But Doug changed all that. Everybody was, he just wanted computers to be at your fingertips and information to be at your fingertips. And anyway, he was going to bid on a project coming out of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is the basic research arm of the Department of Defense. And they were starting this thing called the Arpanet, and they wanted somebody to do an information center on it. And Doug was going to bid on that project, and he came down and talked to me, and I had been working on a project with somebody else, and I thought, geez, 3x5 cards are really not cutting it. We need a computer. So we had come up with a little system to work. It was an information system that was on, I think, GE timeshare. Anyway, he and I chatted, and I did a couple projects for him, short projects. And I was kind of bored where I was, so I said, "Why don't you hire me, Doug?" And he said, "I don't have a job at this time." And so his project came in, and he came down. And he said, "I have a job now. Do you want to come work for me?" And I said, "What is it?" He said, "We need a resource handbook." And I said, "What's a resource handbook?" And he said, "I'm not quite sure, but we need it in 6 weeks." So that's how I joined Doug's group and entered the internet.
So you were aware of who he was, because I from what I've read, it sounds like you transferred into his group a few years after the Mother of All Demos.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
I joined his group in '72.
Okay.
But I had, like I said, he had some test subjects using things, and I'd done a little bit of that, just trying out these things he was doing. And then I had, as I said, I did a short information project for him. And so I knew him, and I was fascinated by what these people were doing. To me,
Right.
It was like the text editing part of it was just colossal. I thought, because if you were writing a letter in those days, if you had a stenographer, you would dictate to the stenographer, and she would type it up on probably 3 pages of carbon. So one went in the file, one went to whoever you were sending it to, and whoever else needed a copy. Anyway, and then you made mistakes, and that was horrible to try to fix. So just looking at these people text editing, I thought, my goodness, the time saving that would do, Plus all the other things. He had links. He had what we call URLs now. He had those in his system. He had almost everything in his system that we use now. The problem was the computers couldn't handle it. They were tiny as far as capacity, and the bandwidth on the network was very low. So his system had issues that way, but as far as its functionality, it was terrific. So that's how I got into working on the internet, and I never did. I don't think I could draw a benzene ring anymore. I just forgot about chemistry.
So when you got involved with the Arpanet project, that was in '72. So it had already been, they had already established the link between Stanford and SRI. Is that correct?
There weren't any links between Stanford and SRI.
I'm sorry, UCLA and SRI.
Yeah, that was done in '68, I believe.
Okay. So when you were involved, how many computers were connected to the Arpanet?
Probably about 30.
Oh, okay. All right. So
because I had the resource handbook that I put together, I believe there were about 30 sites, and what we were doing was writing up what resources were available at those sites, computer resources for people to use across the network.
Got it. And what I've read and heard, and I'm curious what your experience was that the Arpanet wasn't initially used all that heavily until email was invented.
Well, I would say that was the killer app, mainly because it changed the whole way people communicated.
Right.
If you were, ARPA is a military agency, and there were military sites, but there were a lot of university sites on, because that's where big computers were located, and that's where the expertise to run them was located. And so it was a mix of kinds of sites that run a network. But the military sites were the communication between them was very rigid in those days. I mean, you had to go up through channels and then, to the top and then across to the other agency and down those channels. That just went out the door. Yeah. Everybody started talking to everybody, and it was interesting.
Was it, you mean, are you saying that when email was invented, it just opened up the doors of communication between different types of people, where you would have had to go through a big chain of command to access certain people? In the military, it would have been a chain of command. In other places, it would have been, going to secretaries to write letters to the chain of command, and so forth. Right. So it was just so simple, because it was like an inter-office memo, to, from, and whatever you wanted to say, subject. And it really did change the way
I think the whole world communicated. Not, I mean, it wasn't the whole world at that point, but that was the beginning of it.
So what type of resources would people be asking you about if they, from what I've read, it sounds like you were the first person that people would contact to find things out about other sites on the Arpanet. What kind of resources would they be interested in looking for?
Well, there was two things happening. They were building the net at the same time that users were using the net. That was rather confusing. And things were slightly broken all the time, or not quite finished, And so users were confused about, first of all, where do I go? What can I do? What is this thing called a network? I mean, it was very fundamental questions at the beginning. But we set up a network of people. At each site on the network, there was a person called the technical liaison. That was the guy that knew, the protocols. He knew why they were trying to connect that computer to the Arpanet then. He knew all the details, and if something was broken at his site, he'd let us know if you couldn't get to that computer. If we saw something happening, like people were calling and saying, I'm having problems doing something because I can't get to that resource, then we would call that liaison and let them know. So there was really this very, very tight network of knowledgeable people that kept in touch with each other, and we were just kind of the hub of that. We didn't try to answer everybody's question so much as we would send them to the right person that could answer their question.
I got it.
And then the Arpanet was restricted to commercial use. If you were not a contractor, you were not supposed to be on the network. Well, as time went on, it was the best game in town, and many of these sites were at universities, and some of the universities the machines were quite controlled, and other universities, they would say, wait a minute, we're here to teach students and they can do whatever they want on this machine, within reason. Anyway, so you had a lot of people sneaking onto the Arpanet that probably shouldn't have been there, but it was their training ground.
When did it start to become very difficult to maintain this directory of sites and contacts?
Oh, well, first of all, it was a book we put out. I mean, it was hard copy because there was no publishing on the network. There was no email on the network. There was very little on the network except the initial protocol that allowed sites to connect to each other. So we started out with lots and lots of paper and sending all this stuff out by snail mail. And then as time went on, they came up with the FTP, which is the file transfer protocol. And what that meant was if I had a file on my computer, you could reach across the network if I told you it was okay. I mean, if I took the priorities off of it, you could reach across and pull it over to your site. So that started the whole idea of trading documents online without having to put them on paper first. If somebody wanted to put it on paper, they could pull it over and do it at their site, but you didn't have to publish tons of paper to send out, to everybody on the net. So we made that transition. That started in the mid 70s, where people were really pulling. They were really starting to do things online rather than offline. And so then our role kind of changed because we started to develop programs that would do that would allow people to get everything we had and pull it over to their site, or they could come to our site and look at it online. But we still published the Arpanet directory, which was kind of like the phone book for the Arpanet. And then the Defense Data Network, I think we stopped, I can't remember when we stopped doing that, about 86 maybe, because it just got too big. And that's when we went to Who Is, the first Whois system, where you could find out somebody's name, their email address, their host address, all of that kind of thing. It was all online. So it was a transition depending on the protocols and the number of users and the size of the computers.
So I read somewhere that you are credited with coming up with the idea of giving domains, like the top level domain name, to different hosts. So coming up with the idea of assigning a .com, .mil, .gov to different host types.
Yes, we did. Well, I'm not going to take credit. I mean, I was a group. I had a group of 40, 60 people over 20 years. So I was the leader, but they were way ahead of me. If you know what I mean. But anyway, we were a team, so we all worked on this together. But what happened was, I don't know if you're aware of how packet switching works. In the old days, old days, when you had, when you wanted to get on a computer, you got in line, and when your job came up, then you got on the computer. So there was a lot of congestion, a lot of waiting till it was your turn, that kind of thing. And the packet switching would take something you wanted to put online, it would just chop it into little packets and just spew them out on the network. And they would take any route they could find, and they would maybe all go in different directions, but they knew what their destination was. And then when they got to the destination, the packets all put themselves back together and got delivered. But each one of those packets had to have an address on it.
I see.
Otherwise, it wouldn't know where it was going. So the address space, there was finally got to be so many computers on the network that the address space was no longer large enough. And so they had to come up with a different naming system. Also, having just a flat file of names was not a good system. And we were the official provider of that list. It was always out. I mean, one day from the next, it was out of date. So, keeping it up was a horrible problem. And then the sites the small computers were starting to come in, like not the personal computers, but the mini computers, and they didn't have enough space for all of this. So they'd say, well, I don't talk to those people, so I won't put them in my host table. Well, that meant if somebody sent email from a site that wasn't in their host table, it just went flying off into nowhere. So that wasn't a good system. And finally, the space was too small, and it came up. Was John Postel and Paul Macapetris came up with the naming scheme that was I can't think what the word I want. It was hierarchical. You came to the top and then went down a tree structured is what it was, and that required that you have top level naming domains. Well, we were the naming entity on. We managed the naming scheme, but they came up with they were the research group that came up with the new scheme. So I think John wanted, I'm not sure, but I think he wanted to have it based on networks. But what I was getting was big companies saying, like, I don't know it was IBM, but I'm just using this as an example. A big company like IBM would say, we want to be at the top, we want a top level domain, and you go, oh, wait a minute, this is going to be a problem, and then you would have a kid hacker who would say, I want to be a top level domain. You'd say, get lost, kid, But anyway, the other thing was that DARPA was the basic research arm of the Department of Defense. It was not a standards body, but it was fast setting standards for all of this networking. And I would hear the standards people saying, what are they doing setting standards? We're the standards body. And the way the government works, somebody in the government could have just said, DARPA, you don't do standards, ANSI does. So you're out of the business, And so I was thinking, where is there a standards body under each one of these generic names? Also, if somebody was in the military, the structure of their tree structure was going to be absolutely different from somebody that's in education or the other rest of the government or commercial. So that's why we picked these very generic, for two reasons. We picked them because they were generic, and we thought those were the communities that we saw that were developing. Plus, there was a standards body under every one of those that we chose. On the other hand, it didn't happen that the government told DARPA to get out of they did tell them to get out of the standards setting role, but then by that time the Internet Society had been developed, and so that role kind of went over to the Internet Society. But anyway, at the time we developed them, it was an issue that might have come up and been serious if there hadn't been a standards body under each one of those top level domains to say what the structure was going to be.
So this might be a dumb question, but was the database that the precursor to the DNS system, was that kept at SRI so that which matched IP address to domain? Was that something that you guys managed before the DNS system was created?
Yes. From the time there were hosts on the network, and the Network Information Center contract came in 1970, the Network Information Center managed the naming, the host tables.
Right.
And then we managed them after the second system came in, the domain naming system, until 1991, I think, and that's when the network went commercial and SRI lost the contract.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And then it went over to I don't know, places like GoDaddy and commercial. It was what we gave away is now a multi-million-dollar industry.
Right. That's so crazy. So
I know.
I mean, prior to 1991, could anyone register whatever domain name they wanted?
Well, no, it was managed. There was somebody that was in charge of the top level domain. We had instructions of how they wanted to do it, but each domain managed itself in a sense. I mean, they had they had a structure that they wanted to follow, and so as I said, military was very different from the university or the educational one and so forth. And then we added .com as that was an afterthought, because in those days if you were on the network, you were supposed to be have a contract to be on the network, because it wasn't commercial at that point. And so if you didn't have a contract, you weren't supposed to be a commercial entity on the network, and you were absolutely not supposed to advertise on the network, because that was unfair advantage for those contractors that weren't on the network. And so we just thought, well, should we make people who are commercial entities, like SRI was one, should we say they should belong to whoever their contractor is under the domain, or should there be a separate domain for commercial? And we just threw that in as there were some things that didn't quite fit under anything, so we put put them under .org and .com. Little did we know.
Right. So during your time at SRI, do you have any moments that stick with you as being some very historically significant or memorable, exciting moments?
Oh, well, there are many of them, but you're looking at trying to I think if I get what you're trying to do is, give people some insight as to building websites and doing things on the network. And I got very involved at NASA. After I left SRI, I went to work for NASA and Ames down in Mountain View here.
Uh-huh.
And I was, at that point, people were building websites. Mm-hmm. And everybody was putting all kinds of things on the website. There was no and I looked around at what was happening at NASA, and it wasn't that people were intentionally doing something wrong, but they could put something in that they'd taken from somebody else's website. There was no acknowledgement of that. There was all kinds of things are happening on websites that were crazy. I mean, maybe the information was good, but the way they got it, or there was plagiarism, or there was nobody had set a policy, and they were setting some policies that maybe were against the agency's ideas and that kind of thing. So we started looking at how to manage websites, and we had this person called the technical liaison that I mentioned way back when. And those people were technical. They were building the thing, and they were research type people. And then we would have problems come up, which had to do with management. Did the contract cover it? Did the agency want to go in that direction? That kind of thing. And so we then had another person called the host administrator, and that person was somebody that could talk for the agency or talk for the computer that we were working on, or they weren't the technical people, they were the administrative people. So we had those two kind of roles on the network, and we looked at the way people were building websites, and you definitely needed that kind of a role if you were in an agency of some kind or in a company of some kind, because if everybody's putting everything on the net, it could get out of hand. And then the other thing that we found was people were so excited about putting pictures, and graphics had come in just before that. They put pictures on the net. Well, in those days, you could wait 5 minutes for the picture to come up, But I think when you're looking at websites today, there's just a lot of confusion about what the website should do. If it's trying to sell you something, well, get to the point. Don't show me all this stuff I don't care about. And then, for instance, I can think of an example that just I thought it was so funny. I was doing some remodeling, so I bought a light fixture. Okay, how many light fixtures are you going to buy in your life?
4,
okay.
5, 10.
Well, especially one that's going to be installed. So I get every day for a while, I got something about this from this lighting company. Then they finally went down to about a week, and then they wanted me to go to lighting school. And I thought, give me a break, But that's the kind of thing I think people who are doing websites need to think about. What's their focus? If they're trying to sell you something, don't ask me for a password and make up an account and, listen to all this stuff I don't want to hear. I just want to buy something. I'll come and get it. And that's right. I think that's what a company like Amazon has honed in on that. They know that people want to go get it and no nonsense, So there's a lot of things that I think you can think about when you're doing websites.
Well, I think that I was just thinking about Amazon when you mentioned that too, because people don't want to re-enter everything, and usability, it really drives commerce on the web, I think. Good usability. And because everybody's passwords and everything are all stored in Amazon, it just is so easy. It makes it so easy to shop there. I wanted to get back to your time at SRI when you had this privileged position of seeing these early the early graphical user interface and the mouse and all of that. When personal computers first came out and you saw DOS in Windows for the first time, were you disappointed or were you surprised? I mean, all of this really cool technology had been around years prior, and having to deal with DOS, was that a letdown, or did you have an opinion about that?
No, well, it was very interesting because, first of all, the people that developed personal computers had crawled all over Engelbart's stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and put it on a. But the reason personal computers came up in early was that they're just okay. The hosts on the networks in those days could maybe support maximum 100 users. Well, you can imagine this network was growing like crazy. There'd be 100 users, on one computer, and there's now maybe 1,000 computers out there. So it was growing like crazy. Networking was way ahead of what the computers could handle. So people that wanted to get on were getting, it was like, I had to wait forever, and then I couldn't get on, and then maybe it didn't do what I wanted it to do. So the homebrew group decided, let's build our own, and that was exciting, and it had Apple, and it crawled all over what Engelbart did, and so it was pretty much did a lot of the things that were being done on various systems online, but they weren't networked, and so you would have. I know that we were a military contractor, but you would see military sites where one person was sitting next to the other person working on the same thing, and they didn't even know it because they were on personal computers. At one point we came up with a little program which was a little bit ahead of its time, where you could go up to a site, download your email, and work on it on your personal computer, and then upload it to the host computer for networking. And but that was kind of overcome by events because Bob Metcalf came up with the protocol that allowed blanking on the name now.
Ethernet.
Anyway, it was.
You mean Ether?
It allowed small computers to talk to each other, and then finally the protocols were there, so the small computers were networked. Well, then that exploded. That also had a big effect on the naming domains, so that they definitely needed the domain naming system after that. So, so one thing would affect another.
From a usability perspective, though, the early computers that were command line driven, did you think that they were disappointing to use compared to what you had seen at SRI?
In some respects, they were. They didn't have a lot of the fun. Well, what Doug's idea of a computer was that everything you needed was under one umbrella at your fingertips. Well, that was a little. He was very upset when the small computers did a few things well, but everything was a different program. And Apple started out with the concept, and so did Xerox, of Doug's concept of whatever you want, it's under one program. Well, it's not one program, but it was, the user interface was well known, and you could get to anything you wanted to do. You could text edit, you could put out a document, you could program, you could do all of these things. You could link to other people. That was all under one umbrella in Doug's system, but it was too big for the computers at the time. And people thought, well, it's too much to learn. And so the little computers would tend to do each one of those things separately, and then you got into separate programs and separate, you had to buy a program from this company to do this and that company to do that. And so he was disappointed about that. And I still feel, I mean, for instance, nowadays I get a GPS system in my car, but I have to load it or do something with it from my cell phone. I mean, I have to get an app, and the apps go on forever. And if you don't, there's nobody saying this is the best app. Well, there are people saying it, but there's so many people saying it, you don't know what app to get. It's just a kind of word of mouth. There's no manuals for anything anymore. So it's pretty hard to get your, to know where you're headed if you don't have somebody to give you the guidelines.
Do you think, did Doug feel like Apple ripped him off?
Oh, no, he didn't feel it. He wanted this stuff to get out, but he didn't like the way it went. He still wanted everything to be under one umbrella, and and I can understand that I felt like I started out with the best, and it's been downhill ever since. But but there were reasons, when things were commercial that opened up if you look at the apps, you can look at it from the user's standpoint, which is kind of overwhelming, but you look at it at the people producing these, and it's very big business, and a small person with a good idea can get on there and set up a business. You like his app, you'll buy it.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's an exciting time for that reason. We have so much access. Did you, when you were at SRI in those days, did you have an appreciation for the historical significance of what you were doing and where you were in the world at that important time?
Oh, yes. That was to me, I think everybody that was on the net in the early days was very dedicated to making this thing work, and seeing where it could go and how far it could go. And, the guys that came up with small computers, it was the same thing. Computers were just exciting in those days, and the whole network was exciting because look at all the people you could talk to and the things you could do that were just so tedious before, and all of a sudden it's like just dash off a whole document and edit it and send it off, and it was amazing to me, and because I'd been doing all this stuff in 3x5 cards by hand. Oh my God, or a typewriter.
It must be interesting to have witnessed the evolution of Silicon Valley in the last, 40, 50 years.
Oh, yeah. It was funny because in those days, the Japanese were our competitors, and Japanese visitors would come, and they'd come into the information center with a map, and they'd say, "Where's Silicon Valley?" And we'd say, "It's a joke." It was hard to explain. It was sort of like everywhere and nowhere,
That's funny. Now that I read that you volunteer at the Computer Museum, Computer History Museum, and you've donated a lot of archives to the museum. In going through all of this stuff, have you stumbled upon anything that you thought you forgot about or you thought was really interesting?
Well, one of the things that's never seems to get emphasized is this. When I talk about the information center, we were, as I said, we were kind of the hub, but it really worked because we had all these contacts at every site on the network. We had the technical liaison and later the host administrator, and then it was a network of people as well as a network of computers, and they knew what was going on at their site. They knew what was technically going on and what was administratively going on. And so that network of people working back and forth with us was what I think was very, very significant in getting the thing built and then getting the rules of the rules of people played by, if you will. And there was a set of documents on the network called the requests for comments, they were called, or RFCs. I don't know if you're familiar with those. but those were the technical notes that set the direction and the technical direction of the network. And they were very open. Everything was very open. If a kid hacker had a good idea, he could send it to, he could write an RFC, or he could start a working group and talk about, or there were a lot of working groups, and they were very open and democratic. Anybody that had a good idea could get on and voice their opinion, and the rest of the people would say yes or no, or that's stupid, or that's terrific, or and so it was very democratic. I thought that was amazing, along with everything else. What the internet did was it got rid of a lot of cruft, I guess you would call it, red tape. Nobody had to go to school to learn how to write a letter, things like that. It was amazing that it just changed how people did business. And also it was such a breeding ground for the little guy. I mean, take an artist. An artist can walk up to the internet, put their stuff out there, and if somebody wants to buy it, the artist is in business. That never happened before.
Right.
And so that part of it was very amazing to me. The sociology was, in my opinion, much more important than the technology, although the two went together. And now I'm worried, because now we're using the internet for things that I wish we didn't. There's got to be some more guidance. The technology is raced ahead of the governance of it, I think.
Yeah. I saw that you were in the, I can't think of the right word, inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame in 2012.
Yes.
I mean, that must have been a pretty unique and terrific honor.
It was, and I was so surprised, because, most of the people that were on the first Internet Hall of Fame were people that built the network, and I felt like they built it, and we told the world it was there, in a way. But we build our own products and things, but compared to Vint Cerf or Bob Kahn or some of those people, it was a true honor, and I was blown away when they told me.
It must have been neat to meet all those people if you hadn't before.
Well, I knew them as they were kids.
Yeah, right.
We all grew up together on the internet. So, and that was the other thing. When I talked about the liaison, one of them, I can remember, one of my liaison was a Nobel Prize winner. And another one was a kid hacker that could get into anything, so you hired him because otherwise he was going to drive you nuts.
Right. That's so funny.
And the Nobel Prize winner kept calling us. I can tell why he was a Nobel Prize winner. He wanted to know about everything. How does this work? Who does this? Where is that? What can I do? He would call us, and we were going crazy with this guy calling us all the time. And finally, we just teamed him up with a kid hacker, and it was love at first sight. got him from calling us every day, or he would call us 3 or 4 times a day, wanting, where do I go for this? How does this work? Who's doing this? Why are they doing this? He was very, very inquisitive about everything.
So you're kind of like the first internet matchmaker too.
In a way, yes.
Yeah,
well,
putting people together.
For instance, we put out the directory, Arpanet directory, and then the Defense Data Network directory. And we didn't want to put titles in it for several reasons. I mean, during the Vietnam War, so, the people that were in the universities were not happy if they knew they were talking to people that were military. So we didn't put any titles in. You got your name and your email address and your snail mail address, but no title. And also because we were working a military contract. I mean, if somebody got promoted and we didn't get the right title for it, we'd be in trouble. So So that was our decision, no titles. And so a lot of the students didn't realize they were working on a military contract when they worked on the Arpanet.
Uh-huh.
And so they would, everybody was talking to everybody. So again, it was very egalitarian, very democratic, and it kind of policed itself in the early days. If we had a working group and somebody was on it that was, as they said, flaming, saying, "I don't like your idea, you're so and so," the moderator of the group would say, "Knock it off," and if they didn't knock it off, they just didn't get to be on the working group. So everything kind of policed itself in a very democratic way, and that was very exciting.
Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating. I think I don't want to take up any more of your time, but this has been really interesting. You've had a very privileged and exciting life experience.
Well, we're going to have in February, there's going to be a 50th anniversary of the Arpanet Internet, and it's going to be in Washington, D.C. The AAAS is putting it on.
Uh-huh. Oh, cool.
So I'm going to be at that. I think that'll be my last hurrah. I'm going to be 88, so I'm not exactly a spring chicken.
Well, that sounds like it'd be a really fun reunion in some ways.
It will.
With all these people,
And so, and then there's an Englebart one at the museum next Sunday, I think it is, for the 50th anniversary of his big demo.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I read about that on the museum site.
So I didn't partake in that. They wanted me to be on a panel for that, but at the time, my partner was very sick, and he just died 2 months ago.
Oh,
so
I'm sorry.
I just couldn't be involved at that point. But anyway, life is exciting. You never know where it's going to head.
Yeah. You weren't at the Mother of All demos, were you?
No, I was aware of it, but I wasn't there. I knew the group that was there, and that they were all blown away by it.
Yes, I've seen some footage of it on the internet. There's some archival footage. I'm sure you've seen it, but yeah, it's amazing to think of what he was able to do at that time. It's really cool.
I knew Doug. I wasn't working for him then, but I knew the group by that time because I'd done a few little things for him. So they were working on this, and you'd see him, putting it together and doing his grocery list and things like that. So, but it was quite a demo.
What was he like as a person?
Oh, Doug was really, really nice guy. He was very soft-spoken, and he was driven. He had this vision that he wanted to see the world go in this direction, that they would have anything they needed by way of information at their fingertips. That was kind of his view, and also that by what he called bootstrapping, you'd get a group together, they'd work on something and find the best way, and then they'd try another iteration of it, and it would finally get bootstrapped into a good vision or a good product or whatever they were working on. So those were kind of his two things that kind of drove him. And I always say he was a little bit like a turtle. If you went in and complained and bitched about things, he just disappeared into his shell. If you went in with an idea or something that triggered his imagination, he was all ears. But he was he was my boss at one point. He was my mentor, and then after he left SRI, we remained friends until he died. He just died a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So he was a very, very sweet person.
Wow.
And he always kind of felt like he was out there somewhere that you weren't.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely like a step ahead of certainly was a lot of steps ahead of everybody else.
Well,
Well, I just
you
would.
know, it's just that he just had this goal in his mind, and he never felt that he got there. He always felt he was a failure, which was strange because he'd done so much, but he felt like he didn't quite get there, you know.
Uh-huh.
And he didn't like the way the personal computers went. He liked some of it, but he thought they were just too disjointed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to thank you again. This has been really interesting to chat. I really appreciate your help with this.
Well,
and it was
good
nice
luck
to
with
meet
your
you.
book, and
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll
let
let
me
you
know
know.
when it's published.
I will. I'll send you a copy. I promise.
Okay. Well, bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Jake.